Hi everybody, welcome to Bookshore, and today we're going to be talking about Lanark by Alasdair Gray. This is one of those books where you just read and you're like, yo man, this is full of nothing but personal attacks. I've related to this book so heavily. It really mimicked a lot of experiences that I had in life, and it was really difficult to read this book, not on a disturbing intellectual level or difficulty with the prose or anything like that, but just to really like, oh crap, I'm reading way too much of myself right now, and just really having to go through that and see my own faults and my own experiences here. Now, the book is set in actually 4 different books out of order, going from book 3 to 1 to 2 to 4, and then the epilogue, and it takes place between the life of 2 characters. Now, there's going to be spoilers in this review. I really just can't talk about the book without spoilers. But I'll say if you want to read this book, just go buy it. It's amazing. Now, the first life is with the titular character Lanark, who is in a kind of surreal, not quite Silent Hill, but just kind of pseudo-esque, and with, it's a bunch of weird stuff like there's only a few hours of sunlight. There's a bunch of artist folk who are not too kind to him, or he takes things too personally. There's a mouth that opens up that takes him to a hospital, but he has to go in naked, and in turn that hospital has a ridiculous set of rules, and all the patients become doctors, and eventually it turns out that they have to eat human flesh from the dead patients who die because of various diseases like dragonhide that the character has, where they turn into a full-on dragon. And well, actually they don't eat those, because those turn into an energy source because they explode with so much light and heat that they eventually use that to power the hospital. So you can see already super kind of weird and everything. The middle portions, book 1 and 2, is the life of Duncan. Duncan being an artist, you go through his childhood from like elementary up to high school until his college days, being that he is a painter, and he just somebody, there's a great quote where Lanark sees his life and he says like, he's really bad at being happy. And that's just a great way to put it. He's just somebody who doesn't understand the world. He's a bit more of an idealist, and he's not really great when it comes to love. For example, he wants to express his love to this one woman, even though people call her like a tease or a whore or something like that. But in his mind, he just can't see her in that aspect, and he just thinks other guys are being crude. And he just doesn't know how to express his love to her. He's just too shy. He just gets too caught up in his head, and he feels like he has to deal with almost some spectacular display or just some interpersonal validating moment that's special between the two of them. But like a male figure for him who's a bit older than him, but another boy, and that's kind of a common theme of other older male figures kind of helping lead Lanark, tells him like, oh, just ask him out, like, how does she smell? Like, what would he mean? Like, if she smells like a bakery shop, she's a good person. If she smells otherwise, she's probably a whore. Which is very derivative and demeaning, but however, at the same time, what the character is trying to say is that just because you have these ideologies, just because some of them persist in the world, doesn't mean that traditional gender roles don't exist. I mean, yes, they might be stupid. You don't really have a choice in them. You have to abide by them anyway. If you want to have any sort of relationship, because everybody abides to them. And Lanark doesn't like that, but he eventually learns throughout the book. He just gets enough beaten down to the point where it's like he just accepts those roles. He accepts his fate in life. He has these grandiose visions as a kid, but then like eventually it became much smaller and smaller because life just kind of beats him down and his idealism gets away from him. Now, you probably heard me misspoke when I said Lanark. Big spoiler in the book, Duncan and Lanark are the same people. Duncan dies in the book, almost like from like Dostoevsky-esque like disease, where his mental facilities become so impressing on him that his physical body becomes ill from that. It's kind of implied like he might have something other than that also, but it's kind of in that vein, and he eventually passes away from that because he just doesn't eat. He can hardly take a bath. His father has to take care of him. His father, just a hardworking man, just trying to do the best for him because his mother passed away. Encouraged him to go to art school despite how much it's costing his father, and despite how much it's straining the relationship between him and his sister as well. But his dad is just a very loving, supporting man, and Lanark just feels bad because he just can't do the best for him. He just can't get his emotional and mental state together, and eventually he succumbs to it, thus leading Duncan into the life of Lanark, where he's in this mysterious city and he eventually goes to a hospital. And Lanark learns this through watching a mystical pseudo-jinn like show him that, but then his lover at the time sees something, a totally different situation as well. So it's kind of like, oh, how much of it is true? It's probably true. Through that, you can see a lot of this, even though Lanark is a different person in a sense, and he forgot about that, you can see a lot of the same similarities between them, and that childhood almost doesn't escape you. The temperament that you have at that age sometimes carries on into adulthood, especially when you're kind of in your around 18 to like mid-20s, like that kind of just persists within you. Despite how much aspects of your life and situation change, your temperament and personality and your view on life doesn't really change. And it just kind of goes to that quote of St. Augustine, like, what is closer to myself than myself? Escaping that relationship with yourself is something that you really can't do. In a sense, you can change, but it's just something that's always present there. Now, the main things the author getting at with Lanark's childhood is that the idea, again, like I said, idealism, having just too grandiose an idea of yourself, feeling that the world is your oyster, but then you slowly learn that it's really not. He is a very talented artist in the book, and he actually gets a scholarship to art school when he really shouldn't have, because his art doesn't really represent the school in itself, and he gets a lot of leeway and breaks where the director allows him to push off a lot of projects and take a lot of time out of school, even at one point where he spends months outside the school because he's painting the church. But he does it just to such an extent where he keeps changing it. He keeps pushing the date back. He keeps having to spend his own money because he ran out of money for supplies, and it's never finished, and they're getting antsy to the point where eventually the church is going to shut down and his painting's going to be torn down anyway, and he's crying over that, but they let him finish it. And it's that idea that artists always talk about, that work is never finished, it's abandoned, and just that aspect that he can't let that go, and he can't stop seeing his flaws. Something I've experienced with music a lot of times, where sometimes I can't have trouble finishing songs because I keep thinking this is not good enough, and you keep pushing it out there until eventually you have nothing to show for it. He can't show it at his school, he can't show it to, eventually he does get it done. However, he made Adam red because something like that of red of clay, and so people in the Bible, so people thought he was black, and then he gets kind of painted as like a hedonist in the newspaper and everything, and it just really even takes a larger assault on his mental toll, because after finishing it, after doing this very personal work that he trudged through, it's still subject to the critics. It's still interpreted to the masses through the people who are either one part of the church or part of the newspaper, which really sucks for him. And then the fact that it's getting torn down, there's really nothing much he can do about it. Now, when we go back to the hospital, we see that Lanark wants to escape the hospital. He does not like it there. He wants to go into a sunnier territory with a sexy sun and light. They can go outside because everything's insular. And what happens is that what Lanark's trying to get at with the hospital is that the hospital is very much your role in adulthood when you go start working. You get offset with all these arbitrary rules, all these decisions, people in power that don't really make that sense or maybe shouldn't be there. People who it's like, I'm smarter than this guy, or like, hey, this guy's not as competent as he should be. Or it's like, oh, this system's not going to change. Even if these people are, even if my higher ups are smarter than me, they can't do anything about the system. And like for some of the things I talked about, where dead patients eventually become food to feed them, and like patients become doctors even if they don't have the proper training, and all these other arbitrary rules. Even though it's really abstract and absurdist, it's a great metaphor or simile for our life. Here's a little example. I sell insurance, predominantly Medicare insurance, in that I help people go from government insurance and help coordinate it with private insurance companies so they can get better benefits. It sounds boring, I know. However, if you think about it, what do we do? It's money that you've paid in the system all your life, and money that when people are on it, they've paid in the system. It's just taking people's average tax money and putting it into a subset of people who can have access to it, but all that tax money is not available to others. And that's what makes the system work, but it's almost like, again, that cannibalizing, where it's like, okay, this person's not going to get healthy, so their resources are going to get put to these other people. And if you think about it, how absurd insurance is also, insurance only exists because we can abstract the idea of time, and we can think about our future and possibilities that might prevent us from being as mobile, healthy, or well off to do. And so that's why we have insurance. So in the book, you might be reading about all these weird things, but is it that much weirder than our life? Are our systems here any less arbitrary in a sense, or so extrapolated to the human condition that when you really take a step back, you're like, how did this even get formed? By the way, I love my job, but that's kind of like from the childhood, from being a huge idealist to going into the world, and you still have those ideals, because he still wants to go to be an author right there, but he's told he can't be a great author. But he goes into work with these ideals, and they still don't really suit him. The system still has to push him down a bit more. But eventually, then the aspect of love comes out for Lana, because he has this person, Rima, who I guess was in the Duncan story. I didn't really catch that, but she's present through the hospital, and she eventually leaves with Lanark. You can kind of tell they don't. Well, it's complicated. They're not the best partner for each other, which would be the best way to put it, in that they argue a lot. Rima feels Lanark is always very dismissive of her, which is a great way how they do it, because you never really see Lanark do it. You just kind of see her saying it, and one could say like, oh, well, she's unreliable, but at the same time, how often do we realize our own flaws within us, or how much we affect other people and insult other people? So I thought that was a great way just to show it without actually showing it. And Lanark, they get mad at each other. Eventually, they live in the snowy area where they're trying to get to the next world where they can die in. They just start arguing with each other. They start getting on each other. She eventually goes back to an old boo that she had when they go to the new town, and they're just not the best people for each other. And this goes to the next point. They do have a child, but before we get to that, it also kind of goes into the fact that there's two types of love. There's love of the emotional being, and there's love of like, we are going to make this work. And you could have either with somebody who isn't necessarily the best person for you. This idea of soulmate is kind of ridiculous. As you see in a lot of other countries, sometimes when people get together in love, it's sometimes not so much out of emotional viability, but it's more so out of the fact that we are going to work on this. We are prescribed these roles to each other, and we are going to do our best to keep that going. Whether you see that in arranged marriages, communities without a large group of people to be attracted to, or just very traditional household families. And then there's also the somewhat of love where people have that intense, loving, emotional connection. I'm sure we've all experienced this where most of us experienced this where we've had these heavy feelings for somebody. We just want to do nothing but be there for them, but whether because of our own circumstances or their circumstances, that still doesn't work out. And that's what I kind of feel the latter is more for Lanark and Rima, is that there is a love there. You can see it when the older in the novel, they reflect on it. Rima was like, I never hated you, Lanark. You just really weren't a present person, and sometimes you can be a bit selfish, but I've never hated you. I'm never one of the worst for you. So there is a form of love there that they feel between each other, and you can see with Lanark just being kind of a bit obsessed with this, not obsessed, but just really having that passion for her. But they just weren't the best people to have those feelings for each other, just because they couldn't work for each other. And it's just that sad thing of having that intense emotional passion doesn't get rid of all the other human aspects of communication, of ideals, of empathy that is necessary to build that relationship, and just how oftentimes love can be pretty one-sided. The next part, Lanark has a son. For a while, a lot of the weirder, surrealer elements have been kind of out of the novel, but then it comes back here. There's this great moment where Lanark's super happy. He goes, rings the bell when he's born and everything. And by the way, the pregnancy is really fast for Rima. And then when he comes back, he's already a toddler. And like, where were you? You were gone, man. Like, he's a toddler now. He's like, I don't know, he was gone for a little bit. And then he eventually starts working other jobs, and he only spends one day there, but then Rima's already left him. The boy's already 8 years old, Alasdair. And time, it was only been one day at the job, but time has just gone up so much faster in this new city that they're at. Again, a great analogy for when you become an adult, time just slips by. Like, oh my god, like when you're a kid and you have a summer, it's like it feels like a year. It's like, oh my god, I'm so bored, I have 2.5 months of this. When you're an adult and you have a summer, it's like how was summer? Like, there was a summer when it was hot. Oh yeah. And just everything you hear, the older you get, the faster time moves for that. And at this point, it's just a great example of that, of how fast time just slips past Lanark. and he just can't even keep track of his own life. And the next thing he knows, he himself is looking like an old man. He hasn't, because he's trying to support his family, because he's trying to get to this new thing and just trying to come to terms with himself. His passions and ideals in life have passed him. So now life has almost beat him down to the point, and he's been shown like what is actually afforded to him in life, where he becomes a much more passive person. He doesn't become the same, and that's when he goes to the final scene with the epilogue, where older political figure, I forget his name right now, but the one that Rima goes to take care of her and Alexander. He starts to become the political figure in one of the major cities. Then he recruits Lanark, like, hey, you're a smart individual, we need you to go to like the king of this place, and we need you and to talk to this council, and we need you to change the policies here, because we have all these nuclear plants here that are dangerous and can leak, and we need to do reconstruction so that won't let that happen. Again, just more parallel to our world. And Lanark's like, okay, I'll do it. And he considers this guy a big player. He's like almost like the biggest, most powerful person in the novel for him. But then once he gets to go into the council, once he starts hearing words about this guy, and once more political power is put on Lanark, he starts talking to other people and realizes he doesn't have that much power. He's just as much as a pawn as everybody else, not that much further off from Lanark. And again, this just goes to the ideology of when the older you get, the more involved in politics you get, the more the sense of self kind of, I don't want to say disappears, but you kind of get more of an awareness of your bigger world outside of there. For me, example, I'm still young, I'm still like 29, yeah, 29, and like, seeing a lot of the world, I've kind of, in my early 20s, interpreted more of like, what can I do to get my place in this world? And there's still that aspect of there, but after I finished college, it became foolish for me just to ignore the political world, and because of that, I had to get a better ideology of current events and political ideology as well, and become more aware of the political happenings that prior to that I couldn't care less about. And I think that's true for a lot of people, where it's like, you see how little effect you have on the world, but then you still have to keep track of what's going on, who are the powers that be that control our world. But then also, the more you get into that, the more you realize it's not a system based on individuals, it's more based on the system itself. And just going to that postmodern ideology, like with Thomas Pynchon's Gravity's Rainbow, these systems for the sake of systems, and these systems that you can't affect control of, and in a sense, nobody can really completely control, because nobody has a solid grasp of control on those systems. It's all left up to the democracy of individuals, but then that democracy breaks down in itself because certain people of power have a habit of playing the meta and affecting it to a way where they can't get rid of it, but they can turn it and steer it into their own benefit. And that's what kind of Lanark's learning, where he's like, yo, I'm just a pawn, and everybody else is kind of here pawn, and we don't really have a control of much. So that just kind of goes to the final phase of like human ideology, or maybe like one of the first, and that's just the idea of creation, where Lanark does meet the god of this world, and it's Alasdair Gray, the author. And it's this really cute, funny scene, and just like in the postmodern tradition of authors putting themselves into the book, they kind of make themselves out to be bumbling idiots, and Lanark's like, why did you make my life this terrible? Why can't you make it happy? Why do all this stuff? And he's like, it's better for the critics, it's better for the readers if somebody's failing constantly. If you just write a novel of somebody being happy all the time, people get bored. And that makes sense to us, that makes sense to the reader. But to Lanark, he's like, fuck you. But then, like, also Lanark brings up the idea of, like, why did you let me have a son then? He's like, I didn't let you have a son. And he's looking through his notes. But, like, this kind of goes to the effect when you also look at religious ideology. You can see how, like, let's say hypothetically there is a set-natured God. There's a set, or some sort of set universal. In some ways, it doesn't really matter what the universal is, because the message of that is going to be lost through the different ideologies of being human. And even if it isn't intelligent, it's still going to be subject to that. Here's a good example of what I mean. The idea of the hypostasis. I read this with Thomas Aquinas, in that the hypostasis is that the Lord, the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit, the Trinity, is of one being. It is not separate. It is indivisible from each other. It's just the effect of God being in those three places at once, in a sense. The reason being for that is because if Jesus was the Son of God, that would imply that he's a species, and there can be more than one Son of God, aka more than one Messiah. Now, the reason that this was so important is because of the political implications that would entail with other countries having a potential Messiah, which, Messiah is more of a narrative that we see in different human cultures as well. So if we allowed the idea of Jesus to be a species, that would give credence to a lot of other religions, and also a lot of other nations as well. It would be a dangerous thing for the religion, Christianity at the time. So that's why the idea of the hypostasis came in. And you can see how, again, like I said, it's more for a political ideology necessarily than the rule of God. So again, just kind of that idea of the process of God and how we have to fix what is supposedly the word of God, supposedly a universal. We have to add more knowledge to that so that it can fit within our human climate as well. And that's exactly what happening with him. It's like, I had to make you a sad character so it can be more interesting. But is that really necessary? It's like, no, the author was just doing that for his own sake, or the God, for his own sake, so his book can be better. And Lanark, he either had two choices: to say, that's stupid, I'm not believing you, which he kind of does, or to pretty much say, to extrapolate and to put a logic and reasoning behind this universal that already has gaps within it. And Lanark obviously chooses the former. He doesn't say, like, I don't believe in you, because the guy's right there in front of him, but he just says, like, screw it. I'm just gonna go on with my life. And you can even see, like, again, well, Alasdair Gray, this great thing on playing with atheism, he says there is going to be a flood. There's going to be a massive extinction and apocalypse, and it does happen, but it doesn't wipe out the city. He's on a hill watching it, and it just passes, and he's like, oh. And that's when he eventually meets Rima again, and his son actually brings him out of a hospital to save him, to bring him up on that hill. He meets Rima. Rima's like, I never hated you, like I stated earlier. And then the book just kind of peters out and ends in their own way. But that's the beauty of Lanark. What it really does is it takes you through all the phases of life, from idealism to almost a sense of nihilism, in that you really don't have much effect on your circumstances in society, your place in society, your loved ones, and how they interpret your feelings and how you react to them and how they react to you, and even yourself. And you might have these grandiose ideas in life, but it doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be able to put them into effect or achieve them. And in some ways, just finding a small corner of the world and really just presiding there is a beautiful thing in itself, and finding that small form of love. And Lanark does that through his son, Alexander. He loves his son. He's so mad at himself that he can't be more present in his life. And, eventually when he has to live with the politician and Rima, in some ways he's more okay with it, just because he can have somebody there. He knows he's happy, at least. And even though Alexander wants to be with his father, he's kind of standoffish, and he kind of wants to be with him because he just hasn't seen him enough, Lanark still loves him, despite how small of a time he was in his life. He still dreams about him, and he still wants his son to be exceedingly happy. And even when he sees him as an old man, he's just so grateful to see his son. So at least Lanark got some small corner of the world, even if he wasn't able to fully indulge in it. Now, before I wrap up everything, there is that aspect of older male figures leading Lanark through life, which is something that has been pretty present in my life as well. And in that sometimes they tell you things that you don't necessarily want to hear, but that might be true. And again, another great example is that it's like we have a lot of idealisms of what gender roles and dating in society should be like. A lot of them that I subscribe to and that I want to, but the more you go out through life, and the more, and this is also backed up by studies as well, is that the more you see that traditional gender roles are still prevalent. They're still the norm now. And, despite whatever ideologies you have, they might, the society at large, intentional or not, might not subscribe to it. Another good example of that is like communication and emotional intelligence. The older you get, the more you realize people don't really know what they feel, or they can't express it, or they just can't come to terms with themselves. Should it be that way? No. Should we really change that? Absolutely. Are we going to change that? So, having these male figures and tell them stuff that's pretty crass and off the cuff sometimes in a way, it's kind of going to that idea of ideology of being a man in that sense that, hey, you don't really have a choice in this matter. And I'm telling you this not to dismiss your feelings, but to train you how to buckle up and just kind of take the impact, because oftentimes that's all you can do in your present situation. And not getting any MRA on here or anything like that, but it's just like the fact that as a man, a lot of our role is still designated as being the provider, and a lot of our aspects of society don't allow to show that much emotion. If you want a good example of this, also, when you want a good statistic that backs it up, look at the loneliness crisis of the men right now, or look how high the suicide rate is for men compared to females. And it's just a sad thing where we can be have a present ideology of those gender norms, but they're still there. And that's just pretty much why I feel like with a lot of the male figures in life with Lanark, they're just blunt and upfront about it and don't leave a lot of wiggle room, because in life itself there isn't a lot of wiggle room. So with novels, is that sometimes the best ones are the most difficult to get through. There was times in this novel I was kind of wishing it would wrap up sooner, it would go a bit faster, but I'm really glad that in some ways it didn't, because there were times where I even had to put down the book because I just was seeing so much of myself in Lanark, and especially Duncan, and just growing up and just not understanding certain aspects of relationships, and just having a rough time being happy in a lot of aspects. And because of that, it's almost like a weird sort of exposure therapy where you really have to come to terms with what you're reading. And even though that's difficult and it's not the most immediately enjoyable, it is the most satisfying. And books like that, other ones, like a lot of things, Thomas Pynchon, James Joyce, and stuff like that, a lot of those big masculine books, sometimes it's not just like a straight romp, like reading a manga or watching a movie or something like that where you can just enjoy yourself the whole time. Sometimes satisfaction and enjoyment come through the struggle of reading and through the struggle of understanding as well. And this is definitely one of those books where I might not necessarily call it a fun book, but it's totally a satisfying book. And I definitely recommend you checking it out. Again, Lanark by Alasdair Gray, and it has some cool artwork in the book as well, so definitely recommend it.